There is a passage in every fundraising manual ever written, including Nancy Boxcore's Go Fish, that most practitioners gloss over without understanding its full implications. The passage states plainly that the number one reason people do not contribute to campaigns is that they are not asked. The number two reason is that they do not know how much to give. These two observations, when read at the surface level, seem like operational advice, logistical, tactical. But when you peel back the layers, when you understand what Black Lives Matter did between 2013 and 2021, you realize that these two observations contain the entire DNA of what would become the most extraordinary fundraising phenomenon in the history of American social movements. Because BLM did not simply ask, BLM restructured the entire grammar of asking. It made asking unnecessary by engineering an environment in which not giving became psychologically untenable. And it did not tell people how much to give. It made every amount feel simultaneously insufficient and morally necessary. That tension between the insufficiency of any dollar amount and the moral necessity of giving something is the hidden engine that produced $90 million in a single fiscal year from an organization that had no finance committee, no donor pyramid, no PAC kit, no tiered events, and no telemarketing operation. To understand the architecture of what happened, you have to understand something that most fundraising professionals refuse to articulate because it destabilizes their entire framework. The traditional fundraising model, as laid out in texts like Boxcore's, is predicated on the assumption that the fundraiser is selling something, a candidate, a platform, a vision, and the donor is buying that thing. The donor pyramid exists precisely because this transactional model creates natural segmentation. Major donors buy access. Mid-level donors buy social belonging. Low-dollar donors buy issue satisfaction. This is the architecture of every political campaign, every nonprofit development office, every capital campaign in the history of organized fundraising. And embedded within this architecture is a hidden assumption so pervasive that it has become invisible, the assumption that the donor retains sovereignty over the transaction. The donor evaluates the proposition. The donor weighs the costs and benefits. The donor decides. The fundraiser's job is to make that decision as favorable as possible through persuasion, urgency, personalization, and follow-up. But the decision remains the donor's. The donor is the principal. The fundraiser is the agent. Black Lives Matter obliterated this architecture, not by rejecting it, but by discovering something far more powerful. You do not need to sell people a product when you can sell them themselves. The product of BLM was not police reform. It was not criminal justice legislation. It was not even racial equity in any operationally defined sense. The product was the donor's own moral identity, and the price of that product was whatever amount the donor needed to pay to feel that their identity was intact. This is not a metaphor. This is a precise description of the transactional mechanism that drove BLM's fundraising. The donor was not paying for an external outcome. The donor was paying for an internal state, the state of being someone who did something in response to a perceived moral crisis. And the extraordinary power of this mechanism lies in its auto-calibrating nature. Each donor paid exactly what they needed to pay to achieve the internal state, which meant that there was no price resistance, no sticker shock, no need for the organization to justify the amount. The amount justified itself because it was determined not by the organization's budget, but by the donor's psychological need. This is a fundamentally different proposition than anything described in the traditional fundraising literature. Boxcore writes extensively about the importance of monetizing everything, telling donors that their $1,000 contribution will buy radio spots, or their $5,000 will fund a GOTV operation. This is the standard approach. You anchor the ask to a tangible deliverable. The deliverable creates a framework for evaluation. Is this a good use of my money? Will this produce the outcome I want? Am I getting value for my contribution? These are rational questions that the donor asks and the fundraiser must answer. BLM inverted this. The deliverable was not external. There was no radio spot. There was no specific policy outcome tied to a specific dollar amount. The deliverable was the donor's ability to look in the mirror and say, I am not complicit. The deliverable was the psychological resolution of a moral crisis that BLM had the extraordinary power to both manufacture and temporarily resolve. And because the deliverable was internal, because it existed in the donor's psyche rather than in the external world, it could never be audited, evaluated, or found wanting. You cannot measure the ROI of self-perception. You cannot fact-check a feeling. You cannot demand a refund on your own moral identity. Here is the hidden mechanism that sits beneath this insight, and it is the mechanism that connects BLM's fundraising to a much deeper structure in political economy, the commodification of moral sentiment. In classical political economy, commodities are goods that are produced for exchange rather than for use. A commodity has both a use value, what it does, and an exchange value, what it costs. The genius of BLM's fundraising model is that it created a commodity, moral identity, whose use value and exchange value are identical. The use of the commodity is the feeling of moral integrity. The exchange is the donation. There is no gap between what the donor receives and what the donor pays, because the act of paying is the receipt. The transaction is self-referential. The commodity consumes itself in the moment of purchase. And this self-referential commodity has a property that no traditional fundraising product possesses. It cannot be stockpiled. The feeling of moral integrity is perishable. It decays with time, with new information, with new moral challenges. Each new incident of police violence, each new protest, each new social media wave degrades the donor's existing moral inventory and creates a new purchase occasion. The donor must keep buying, must keep donating to maintain their moral position. This is not a subscription model. It is something more powerful, a depreciation model in which the product's value declines continuously, requiring continuous repurchase. Consider the structural genius of this from a pure capital formation perspective. In the traditional model described in Go Fish, the fundraiser must overcome a series of objections. The donor has not been asked. The donor does not know how much to give. The donor is unconvinced the campaign is winnable. The appeal is not personalized enough. The donor does not feel appreciated. Each of these objections represents a friction point that the fundraising operation must systematically address. Boxscore describes these friction points with the precision of a sales engineer. You greet the prospect, you make small talk, you deliver the pitch, you close the deal. This four-step process assumes friction at every stage. The greeting overcomes the friction of unfamiliarity. The small talk overcomes the friction of social distance. The pitch overcomes the friction of ignorance. The close overcomes the friction of inertia. BLM's innovation was to create a psychosocial environment in which the friction points disappeared entirely, not because they were addressed, but because the emotional stakes of the moment overwhelmed them. When the entire cultural apparatus of American media, social media, corporate communications, and peer-to-peer discourse is converging on a single message, that racial injustice is the defining moral crisis of the moment, and that silence is complicity, the standard objections evaporate. Nobody needs to be asked when the entire information environment is functioning as a continuous, ambient, inescapable ask. Nobody needs to know how much to give when the act of giving, any amount, is reframed as the minimum cost of moral participation. Nobody needs to be convinced the campaign is winnable when the metric of success is not a policy outcome, but the donor's own psychological state. Nobody needs a personalized appeal when the appeal is already the most personal thing imaginable, a challenge to the donor's own moral self-concept. This disappearance of friction is not merely a tactical advantage. It is a categorical transformation in the economics of fundraising. In traditional fundraising, friction is the primary cost center. The finance committee exists to reduce the friction of unfamiliarity. The committee member's personal relationship with the donor reduces social distance. The PAC kit exists to reduce the friction of ignorance. The kit provides the information that the PAC needs to evaluate the candidate. The tiered event exists to reduce the friction of price sensitivity. The tiers create multiple entry points at different dollar levels. The direct mail piece exists to reduce the friction of inertia. The physical letter, arriving in the mailbox, interrupts the donor's default state of non-giving. All of these friction reduction mechanisms have costs. The finance committee requires recruitment, training, and management. The PAC kit requires research, design, and production. The event requires venue rental, catering, and volunteer coordination. The direct mail piece requires copywriting, printing, and postage. These costs are substantial, and they are the reason that Boxscore repeatedly emphasizes the distinction between gross and net dollars. Remember, you can't spend gross dollars, only net. BLM's elimination of friction eliminated these costs. When the information environment is your finance committee, you do not need to recruit, train, or manage committee members. When the cultural discourse is your PAC kit, you do not need to research, design, or produce informational materials. When every moment of every day is your fundraising event, you do not need to rent a venue, hire a caterer, or coordinate volunteers. When every news broadcast, every social media post, every corporate statement is your direct mail piece, you do not need to write copy, print letters, or buy postage. The gross-to-net ratio approaches 1-to-1, minus only the credit card processing fees charged by Act Blue charities, approximately 3.95% per transaction. This means that of BLM's approximately $90 million in contributions, roughly $86 to $87 million was net revenue. Compare this to a traditional direct mail campaign where the gross-to-net ratio on a prospecting mailing might be 1-to-1, break even, or worse, and where even a mature donor file produces gross-to-net ratios of perhaps 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 after accounting for all costs. BLM's fundraising efficiency was not incrementally better than traditional methods. It was categorically different. It operated on a different cost curve entirely. Now let me surface the mechanism that makes this architecture truly unprecedented, because it operates at a level of abstraction that the fundraising literature does not touch. What BLM achieved was not merely the elimination of fundraising costs, it achieved the externalization of fundraising labor. In the traditional model, the fundraising labor, the work of identifying prospects, cultivating relationships, making asks, processing donations, and managing donor relationships, is performed by the organization and its agents, staff, consultants, volunteers, finance committee members. This labor has costs, salaries, commissions, overhead. These costs are internal to the organization and are deducted from gross revenue to produce net revenue. BLM externalized this labor entirely. The work of identifying prospects was performed by social media algorithms, which surfaced BLM-related content to users who were likely to engage with it. The work of cultivating relationships was performed by the cultural discourse, which created an ambient environment of moral urgency that predisposed potential donors to give. The work of making asks was performed by millions of individual social media users who shared donation links, by corporations that included BLM, giving URLs in their solidarity statements, by media outlets that published stories with embedded donation links, and by the peer-to-peer social dynamics that made sharing a BLM donation link a form of social currency. The work of processing donations was performed by ActBlue Charities, which handled all credit card processing, compliance reporting, and donor data management. And the work of managing donor relationships was not performed at all, because the model did not require donor retention. It required only donor acquisition, and the acquisition was performed for free by the information environment. This externalization of fundraising labor is the hidden mechanism that explains BLM's seemingly impossible efficiency. It is also the mechanism that makes BLM's model both revolutionary and unreplicable in its specific form, because the labor was not externalized deliberately. It was externalized by the convergence of cultural, technological, and political conditions that cannot be manufactured on demand. The media covered BLM because police violence is newsworthy. Social media amplified BLM because outrage generates engagement. Corporations aligned with BLM because reputational risk demanded it. Individuals shared BLM content because social dynamics incentivized it. Each of these actors performed fundraising labor on BLM's behalf, not because BLM directed them to, but because their own incentives, commercial, social, psychological, institutional, aligned with BLM's fundraising interests. BLM was the beneficiary of a convergence of externalities so profound that it constituted a fundraising infrastructure more powerful than any that could be built intentionally. The first load-bearing wall of this architecture was the fiscal sponsorship arrangement. From its founding in 2013 through mid-2020, the Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation did not operate as an independent 501c3. It operated under the fiscal sponsorship of Thousand Currents, a 501c3 based in Oakland, California. This arrangement, which most donors never understood and which most media outlets never explained, was the hidden plumbing that made BLM's explosive fundraising possible. Under fiscal sponsorship, BLM could receive tax-deductible charitable contributions without having its own nonprofit status, its own board of directors in the traditional sense, or its own independent financial reporting obligations. The fiscal sponsor held the money. The fiscal sponsor managed compliance, and crucially, the fiscal sponsor provided the legal infrastructure for BLM to receive donations through platforms like ActBlue Charities, the charitable arm of the same ActBlue platform that processes billions in democratic political donations. But here's the detail that almost no analyst has surfaced. The fiscal sponsorship arrangement did not merely provide legal infrastructure. It provided epistemic cover. When critics, journalists, or potential donors asked questions about BLM's finances, where does the money go? Who controls it? What is it spent on? The fiscal sponsorship arrangement created a legitimate-sounding answer. The funds are held and managed by our fiscal sponsor, Thousand Currents, a respected international grant-making organization that simultaneously satisfied the question and deflected further inquiry. The donor who heard this answer could file it under sounds legitimate and move on. The journalist who heard this answer faced the additional reporting burden of investigating Thousand Currents, a separate organization with its own complexity, rather than simply auditing BLM's books. The fiscal sponsorship arrangement was, functionally, an information asymmetry machine. It created the appearance of institutional oversight while distributing the actual oversight across multiple entities in a way that made comprehensive scrutiny extraordinarily difficult. This is where the fundraising manual's advice about campaign infrastructure takes on an entirely different meaning. Boxscore describes the importance of having a digital donations platform, a website, a mass email system, and optionally, a texting platform. These are presented as operational necessities, the plumbing through which money flows. But for BLM, the platform itself, ActBlue Charities, was not merely plumbing. It was a credibility signal. It was a trust proxy. It was the mechanism through which the donor's trust in a familiar political donation platform was transferred to an unfamiliar social movement organization. ActBlue had already been normalized by years of democratic political campaigns. Millions of donors had their credit card information stored in ActBlue's system. The one-click donation experience that Boxscore describes as a key advantage of platforms like ActBlue and WinRed became, for BLM, the mechanism through which emotional impulse was converted to financial transaction with zero friction. A person could watch a video of George Floyd's death, feel the full weight of that horror, see a link to donate to BLM, click that link, and complete a donation in under 5 seconds, because their credit card was already stored in ActBlue from a prior political contribution. The emotional impulse never had time to cool. The deliberative process never engaged. The architecture was optimized not for informed giving, but for impulse giving at scale. And here is the dual marketing hack that no one has articulated. BLM's donation infrastructure benefited from what I call trust laundering through platform familiarity. The donor did not trust BLM. They had no basis for trusting BLM because BLM had no financial track record, no charity ratings, no audited financial statements, and no governance track record that the typical donor could evaluate. But the donor trusted ActBlue because they had used ActBlue before, because ActBlue was associated with candidates and causes they already supported, and because ActBlue's interface was familiar and professional. The trust that had been built by years of democratic political fundraising through ActBlue was, in effect, transferred to BLM through the simple fact that BLM's donation page was hosted on ActBlue's platform. This is trust laundering, the process by which an untrusted entity borrows the trust of a trusted intermediary, and it is one of the most powerful and least understood mechanisms in modern digital fundraising. Every new organization that processes donations through ActBlue or WinRed benefits from this trust transfer to some degree. But BLM benefited more than any organization in history because the trust deficit it needed to bridge was the largest, an organization with no financial track record receiving tens of millions of dollars, and the trust reservoir it was borrowing from was the deepest, the entire history of democratic political giving through ActBlue. The second load-bearing wall was the decentralized brand structure, and its hidden mechanism is what I call accountability diffusion through brand multiplicity. BLM was not a single organization. It was a name, a hashtag, a cultural signifier. There were local BLM chapters that operated independently. There was the Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation. There were affiliated organizations, unaffiliated organizations, and organizations that simply used the BLM name without any formal connection. This multiplicity meant that BLM existed as both a specific, donatable entity and a diffuse cultural movement that could not be reduced to any single entity. When someone said, "I support BLM," they could mean any of 100 things. When someone criticized BLM, defenders could redirect the criticism to whichever entity was not being criticized. If the criticism targeted BLM, Global Network Foundation, defenders pointed to the broader movement. If the criticism targeted the movement's tactics, defenders pointed to the foundation's stated mission. The brand was a moving target, not because it was evasive, but because it was genuinely multiple. This multiplicity created a fundraising advantage that has no parallel in traditional campaign finance. In Boxscore's framework, a campaign is a single entity with a single donation page, a single bank account, and a single set of financial obligations. The campaign's identity is fixed and auditable. When donors give, they know exactly what entity they're giving to. When critics scrutinize, they know exactly what entity they are scrutinizing. This transparency is presented as a virtue, and for traditional campaigns, it is. But BLM demonstrated that in certain conditions, opacity is more valuable than transparency, because opacity allows the brand to be whatever each individual donor needs it to be. The donor who wanted to support police reform could believe BLM was about police reform. The donor who wanted to support community investment could believe BLM was about community investment. The donor who wanted to signal anti-racism could believe BLM was about anti-racism. The brand's meaning was determined by the donor, not by the organization, and this donor-determined meaning maximized the potential donor pool by eliminating the specificity that would have excluded donors who disagreed with any particular programmatic choice. The third load-bearing wall was the media amplification loop, and its hidden mechanism operates through what media theorists call agenda-setting cascade, the process by which a story moves from specialized media to mainstream media to social media to interpersonal conversation to cultural common knowledge. In the traditional fundraising model, the organization must push its message through each level of this cascade, investing resources at each stage, press releases for media coverage, social media management for online amplification, talking points for grassroots volunteers. BLM's relationship to the media cascade was the reverse. The cascade pulled BLM's message through each level without any organizational push. The media covered police violence because it is newsworthy. Social media amplified the coverage because it generates engagement. Interpersonal conversation absorbed the coverage because it was culturally unavoidable. And at every level of the cascade, BLM's brand, its name, its logo, its donation link, was embedded in the narrative. The cascade was not a distribution channel that BLM used. It was a distribution channel that used BLM, that needed BLM as a focal point for its own narrative requirements. The numbers tell the story. In the fiscal year ending June 30th, 2020, the Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation reported receiving approximately $90 million in contributions. To put that number in context, the entire annual fundraising budget of most congressional campaigns, including incumbents with established donor networks, finance committees, PAC relationships, and years of list building, is a fraction of that amount. The National Republican Congressional Committee, the official campaign arm of House Republicans, raised approximately $194 million in the entire 2020 cycle, across all of its operations, all of its candidates, all of its programs. BLM raised nearly half that amount in a single quarter, with no institutional infrastructure, no paid staff beyond a skeleton crew, no political action committee network, and no history of major donor cultivation. The implications of this are staggering. Every framework in the traditional fundraising manual, the donor pyramid, the segmentation strategy, the finance committee structure, the event planning process, the direct mail testing protocol, all of these are optimized for a world in which the fundraiser must generate attention before generating revenue. They are solutions to the attention problem. BLM operated in a world where attention was given to it freely and abundantly by the most powerful information distribution networks on the planet. The fundraiser's eternal problem, how do I get people to notice me, was solved before BLM ever had to address it. And with the attention problem solved for free, the fundraising problem reduced to a single operational requirement: maintain a functioning donation page. That's it. That is the totality of the organizational infrastructure required to raise $90 million when the attention economy is working in your favor. A website, a donate button, a payment processor. Everything else, the urgency, the persuasion, the social proof, the moral framing, the peer-to-peer solicitation, was provided by the culture itself. And here is the deepest asymmetry of all, the one that no analyst has articulated because it requires holding two contradictory truths simultaneously. BLM's fundraising success was not proportional to its organizational sophistication, it was inversely proportional to it. The less BLM looked like a traditional organization, the fewer specific programs it could point to, the fewer governance structures it had in place, the fewer financial disclosures it provided, the more powerful its fundraising proposition became. Because specificity invites scrutiny, specificity invites comparison, specificity invites the donor to evaluate whether the money was well spent. BLM's strategic ambiguity, whether intentional or emergent, meant that every dollar donated was protected from evaluation by the sheer abstraction of the cause. You cannot audit a feeling, you cannot measure the ROI of moral participation, and you cannot ask for a refund on your own identity. The traditional fundraising manual says, tell donors exactly what their money will do. BLM's hidden lesson says, the less you tell donors about what their money will do, the more money you will raise, provided the emotional intensity of the moment is sufficient to override the donor's evaluative faculties. This is not advice. It is an observation about the structure of capital formation in a media-saturated, emotionally reactive, digitally frictionless donation environment. And it is the single most important insight in modern fundraising that no fundraising manual has the courage to articulate. Every fundraising textbook in existence, including Box Score's Go Fish, teaches the donor pyramid as gospel. The pyramid is the fundamental organizing metaphor of professional fundraising. A small number of major donors at the top contribute the largest share of revenue. A larger group of mid-level donors in the middle contribute through events and social engagement. And a massive base of low-dollar donors at the bottom contributes through direct mail and, increasingly, digital appeals. The entire apparatus of professional fundraising, the finance committee, the PAC kit, the tiered event structure, the candidate call time schedule, is designed to optimize revenue extraction from the top of this pyramid. Major donors get personal visits, mid-level donors get cocktail receptions, low-dollar donors get form letters, the hierarchy is explicit, the resource allocation follows the hierarchy, and the hierarchy is presented as a natural law of fundraising rather than what it actually is, an artifact of the cost structures that prevailed in the pre-digital era. This is the hidden structural flaw that BLM's fundraising exposed, and it is a flaw so fundamental that it invalidates the basic premises of professional fundraising for any organization operating in a high-attention, low-friction digital environment. The flaw is this: the donor pyramid is not a description of donor behavior. It is a description of fundraising costs. The reason that major donors are at the top is not that they are intrinsically more valuable per dollar raised. It is that the cost of acquiring and retaining a major donor, the personal visit, the relationship maintenance, the customized solicitation, is lower per dollar raised than the cost of acquiring and retaining a low-dollar donor through direct mail. The pyramid is a cost optimization model masquerading as a donor segmentation model, and when the cost structure changes, when digital platforms reduce the marginal cost of low-dollar donor acquisition to near zero, the pyramid inverts. Boxscore describes the three basic methods of raising money in pyramidal terms: person-to-person solicitation for major donors, events for mid-level donors, and direct response, mail-in phones, for low-dollar donors. She notes that person-to-person solicitation is the most cost-effective type of fundraising, and that direct mail programs take the most time to produce significant results. These statements are accurate within the cost structure she's describing. Person-to-person solicitation costs approximately $0 in direct costs per dollar raised. The candidate's time is the primary input, and the candidate's time is a sunk cost of the campaign. Direct mail prospecting costs approximately $1 per dollar raised break-even on the first touch, with profitability emerging only through repeated solicitation of the acquired donor file. Given these cost structures, the pyramid is rational. You invest the most organizational attention in the fundraising method with the lowest marginal cost per dollar raised, which is major donor solicitation. But observe what happens when you remove the cost constraints. In a digital environment where a donation page can receive unlimited visitors at zero marginal cost per visitor, where credit card processing is the only variable cost at approximately 3.95% through ActBlue, and where the solicitation is performed for free by the information environment, the cost curve for low-dollar donor acquisition becomes radically different. The marginal cost of acquiring one additional $25 donor through BLM's digital infrastructure in the summer of 2020 was, for all practical purposes, zero. There was no incremental email to send. The donor found BLM's donation page through organic means, news coverage, social media, peer referral. There was no incremental ad to buy. The donation page traffic was organic. There was no incremental staff time to invest. The donation process was fully automated through ActBlue. The only cost was ActBlue's processing fee of approximately 99 cents on a $25 donation. This means that BLM's cost per dollar raised from low-dollar donors was approximately 4 cents. Not $1 as in the direct mail model, but 4 cents. This is a 25 times improvement in cost efficiency compared to direct mail prospecting. And it transforms the economics of the donor pyramid so completely that the pyramid ceases to be a useful model. Here is where the analysis goes deeper than anyone has taken it. The traditional pyramid model assumes that the value of a donor segment is determined by a simple formula: number of donors times average gift size times gift frequency minus acquisition and retention costs equals segment value. In this formula, the major donor segment wins because its average gift size is large and its acquisition cost per dollar raised is low. The low dollar segment loses because its average gift size is small and its acquisition cost per dollar raised is high in the direct mail model. But this formula omits a variable that becomes decisive in the digital environment: the donor's externality value, the value that each donor creates for the organization beyond their own contribution. In the traditional model, a major donor's externality value is limited. They might introduce the candidate to one or two additional potential major donors. They might host a fundraising event, which Boxscore describes in detail. They might lend their name to the campaign as an endorsement. These are valuable externalities, but they are linear. Each major donor produces a finite, countable number of additional connections. In the digital model, a low-dollar donor's externality value can be exponential. When a $25 donor shares their donation on social media, they are not producing a single additional connection. They are broadcasting to their entire network, 200, 500, 1,000 plus people, and some percentage of those people will themselves donate and share, creating a cascade. Each $25 donor is, functionally, a node in a viral distribution network, and the value of that node is not the $25 they contributed, but the $25 times the number of additional donors their sharing generates, times the number of additional donors those donors' sharing generates recursively. This is the network externality of low-dollar donors, and it is the mechanism that inverts the pyramid. BLM's fundraising exploited this network externality more completely than any prior organization. Every $25 donor who shared their donation on Instagram, every $10 donor who tweeted their ActBlue receipt, every $50 donor who posted on Facebook urging their friends to give, all of them were performing the fundraising labor that, in Boxscore's model, is performed by the finance committee. But unlike the finance committee, which must be recruited, trained, managed, and motivated, these self-organizing donor solicitors required zero organizational investment. They were motivated not by loyalty to the campaign, but by the social dynamics of the platform, the desire for visible virtue, the pressure of peer conformity, the emotional momentum of the moment. And unlike the finance committee, whose reach is limited to their personal and professional networks, each social media donor solicitor had a potential reach of hundreds or thousands of contacts, and the algorithmic amplification of the platform could extend that reach to tens of thousands if the post generated sufficient engagement. Let me quantify the hidden economics here, because the numbers reveal an asymmetry that the traditional fundraising literature has never articulated. In Boxscore's model, a finance committee of 20 members, each with a goal of raising $5,000, produces a maximum of $100,000 in total revenue. The organizational cost of this committee, recruitment, training, management, materials, might be $10,000 to $20,000 in staff time and direct costs. The net revenue per committee member is approximately $4,000 to $4,500. This is the efficient frontier of committee-based major donor fundraising. Now consider BLM's inverted model. Suppose that of BLM's approximately 1.5 to 2 million individual donors in 2020, 10%, 150,000 to 200,000, shared their donation on social media. Suppose that each share reached an average of 300 people. Suppose that 0.5% of those reached, a conservative estimate given the cultural intensity of the moment, were moved to donate. That produces 175,000 shares times 300 reach times 0.5% conversion equals 262,500 additional donors. At an average gift of $30, that is approximately $7.9 million in revenue generated entirely through donor-driven peer solicitation at zero organizational cost. This is the equivalent of having a finance committee of 1,575 members at $5,000 per member, except that BLM did not recruit, train, or manage a single one of them. The entire $7.9 million in peer-solicited revenue was free, and this estimate is almost certainly conservative because it does not account for the second-order effects, the donors acquired through peer solicitation who themselves shared and generated additional donors, or the third-order effects or the nth-order effects. The cascade is recursive, and the total value of the cascade is not the sum of individual donor contributions, but the product of the viral coefficient multiplied across the entire network. This is the donor pyramid inversion, the discovery that in a digitally networked, high-attention, low-friction fundraising environment, the base of the pyramid, the low-dollar, digitally acquired, socially motivated donor, is not the least valuable segment. It is the most valuable segment because each donor is not merely a source of revenue, but a node in a self-replicating distribution network. The pyramid inverts because the network externality value of low-dollar donors exceeds the direct contribution value of major donors when the network is sufficiently large and the viral coefficient is sufficiently high. But the inversion goes deeper than raw economics, and this is where the analysis enters territory that no fundraising strategist has mapped. The inverted pyramid also created a political asset that no traditional fundraising architecture can produce, what I call democratic capital, the conversion of donor count into political legitimacy, independent of donor dollars. In the traditional model, political capital is proportional to dollars raised. A candidate who raises $10 million is taken more seriously than a candidate who raises $1 million, regardless of how many individual donors contributed. The fundraising total is the signal. The donor count is, at best, a secondary metric. BoxScore's entire framework is oriented toward maximizing total dollars, not total donors. The Finance Committee's goal is a dollar amount, not a donor count. The event's success is measured in net revenue, not in headcount. The direct mail program's ROI is calculated in dollars per dollar spent, not donors per dollar spent. BLM inverted this hierarchy of metrics. For BLM, the donor count was more valuable than the dollar total because the donor count functioned as evidence of mass support, which functioned as political legitimacy, which functioned as cultural authority, which functioned as additional fundraising power. Each additional donor, regardless of amount, increased BLM's claim to represent the people rather than the elites. And in a political environment where populist legitimacy is the ultimate currency, where both left and right valorize grassroots authenticity over institutional power, this claim to democratic legitimacy was worth more than any dollar total could be. This dynamic explains why BLM's $27 average donation was not a liability but an asset. In the traditional fundraising model, a $27 average donation signals a failure to cultivate major donors. It signals an organization that has not done the hard work of relationship building, personalized solicitation, and tiered engagement that produces high-dollar gifts. But in BLM's inverted model, the $27 average donation signaled exactly the opposite. It signaled that BLM's support came from everyday Americans, not from wealthy elites or corporate interests. It signaled moral authority derived from mass participation rather than financial power derived from concentrated wealth. And this moral authority, this democratic capital, was in turn the most powerful fundraising asset available because it made additional donors want to join a movement that belonged to the people. This is the self-reinforcing loop at the center of the inverted pyramid. More small donors leads to greater democratic legitimacy, leads to more media coverage. Because mass movements are more newsworthy than elite-funded organizations, leads to more attention, leads to more small donors, leads to greater democratic legitimacy, leads to more media coverage, leads to and so on, in a positive feedback loop that has no analog in the traditional fundraising model. The traditional model is linear. You invest in acquisition, you acquire donors, you invest the revenue in more acquisition. The inverted model is exponential. Each additional donor increases the factors that drive additional donor acquisition, creating a compounding effect that grows faster than any linear investment can match. There's one more dimension to this inversion that most analysts miss entirely because it requires thinking about power rather than money. In the traditional pyramid, the major donor at the top has disproportionate influence. They get personal meetings with the candidate, they get input on strategy, they get their phone calls returned. The relationship between the major donor and the organization is bilateral. The donor gives money, and the organization gives access, information, and responsiveness. This bilateral relationship creates accountability. The major donor can withhold future contributions if they are dissatisfied. The major donor can demand information about how their money is being spent. The major donor can leverage their contribution into organizational influence. The inverted pyramid eliminates this accountability mechanism entirely. And this elimination is not a side effect. It is the mechanism through which the inverted pyramid generates its most enduring fundraising advantage. When your donor base consists of millions of people giving $25, no individual donor has leverage. No individual donor can demand accountability. No individual donor can withhold a meaningful amount of future revenue. No individual donor can influence organizational decisions through the threat of reduced giving. The organization's relationship with its donor base is not bilateral. It is broadcast. The organization transmits, the donors receive. The organization asks, the donors give. There is no feedback mechanism, no accountability structure, and no governance relationship between the small dollar donor and the organization. From a pure fundraising perspective, this is not a flaw. It is the ultimate feature. It means that the organization has maximum freedom to allocate resources as it sees fit, without the constraint of donor expectations, donor oversight, or donor influence. The organization can spend money on real estate, on consulting fees, on travel, on anything, and no individual donor has the standing, the information, or the leverage to object effectively. This is the opposite of what happens in traditional major donor fundraising, where, as Boxscore describes, major donors want to know exactly what the money will be spent on, and PACs conduct detailed evaluations of campaign viability before contributing. The inverted pyramid, then, is not merely an economic phenomenon, it is a power phenomenon. It represents the discovery that in a digital fundraising environment, the most financially powerful structure is also the least accountable structure, and that this lack of accountability is, paradoxically, what makes the structure sustainable over the short to medium term. Because the donors are not buying a specific outcome, they are buying a feeling, they are buying moral identity. And feelings and moral identity do not require an annual report, an independent audit, or a board of directors. They require only the continued existence of the brand, the continued availability of the donation page, the continued cultural relevance of the cause. As long as those conditions hold, the inverted pyramid sustains itself without the organizational overhead that the traditional pyramid demands. There is a section in Boxscore's Go Fish that discusses generating media coverage for fundraising events. The advice is sensible and conventional. Decide whether to invite reporters, manage their expectations, underestimate the number of attendees, control the level of media access, create a hashtag, provide Wi-Fi and snacks. This is the standard calculus of earned media in political fundraising. Media coverage is a bonus, a way to generate momentum and credibility, a supplement to the real work of selling tickets and making personal asks. BLM revealed that this framework is not merely limited, it is operating in the wrong category entirely. It is like describing the ocean as a supplement to swimming pools. What BLM demonstrated is that when earned media is not supplementary to fundraising but constitutive of it, when the media coverage itself is the fundraising event, running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, across every information channel simultaneously, the economics of fundraising are no longer constrained by organizational capacity. They are constrained only by the intensity and duration of media attention. And in the summer of 2020, the intensity was unprecedented and the duration extended for months. To quantify what happened using the framework that media buyers use to value exposure, in the summer of 2020, the total advertising equivalent value of earned media coverage related to Black Lives Matter, if you calculated it using standard media buying rates across television, digital, print, social media, and out of home, was conservatively in the range of $5 to $10 billion. This number is almost certainly an underestimate because it does not account for the organic social media impressions generated by hundreds of millions of individual posts, shares, and stories. Every cable news segment that mentioned ABLM at a 30-second spot rate of $5,000 to $50,000 depending on the network and time slot. Every newspaper front page at a full-page ad rate of $50,000 to $250,000 for major dailies. Every trending topic on Twitter, which platforms have valued at $200,000 to $500,000 per promoted trend. Every Instagram story from a celebrity with millions of followers at influencer rates of $10,000 to $500,000 per post. The aggregate advertising equivalent value of BLM's earned media in the summer of 2020 exceeds the total annual advertising budgets of most Fortune 500 companies. And BLM paid nothing for it. 0 media buys, 0 advertising spend, 0 influencer fees, 0 sponsorships. The most expensive marketing campaign in American history was produced entirely for free, funded by the commercial incentives of media organizations. Outrage drives ratings, the algorithmic incentives of social media platforms, engagement drives ad revenue, and the social incentives of individual users, sharing drives status. Now here is the mechanism that sits beneath this observation, and it requires a framework from media economics that fundraisers almost never encounter, the concept of attention arbitrage. Attention arbitrage is the practice of acquiring attention at a price lower than its value, buying it cheap and deploying it for more than you paid. In traditional marketing, attention arbitrage is difficult because attention markets are relatively efficient. The cost of a television ad, a Google search placement, or a Facebook impression roughly reflects the value of that attention to the average buyer. You can find marginal inefficiencies, a keyword that is underpriced, a time slot that is undervalued, but the opportunities for large-scale arbitrage are limited. BLM achieved attention arbitrage at a scale that should be theoretically impossible because the mechanism was not market-based. BLM did not buy underpriced attention. BLM received donated attention, and the donors were not philanthropists or supporters. The donors were commercial media organizations acting in their own commercial interest. CNN covered the protests because protests generate ratings. The New York Times covered the protests because protests generate readership. Facebook's algorithms amplified protest content because protest content generates engagement. Twitter's trending algorithms surfaced BLM-related hashtags because those hashtags generated the most conversation. Every one of these actors was pursuing its own commercial objective, maximizing audience, engagement, and revenue. And in doing so, they were collectively producing the most valuable marketing campaign in BLM's history. The attention was not bought. It was not even sought. It was a byproduct of the commercial media system's structural incentives. This is the hidden economic model. BLM's fundraising was parasitic on the attention economy. Not in a pejorative sense, but in a precisely structural sense. BLM extracted value from an attention ecosystem that was generating attention for its own commercial purposes. The media generated the attention. BLM captured the attention. The donation infrastructure converted the attention to revenue. And the cost of this entire value chain, from attention generation to revenue capture, was borne entirely by external parties. The media organizations that produced the content, the social media platforms that distributed it, the individual users who amplified it. BLM's role in this value chain was passive. It existed, it maintained a donation page, and it waited for the attention to arrive. This passivity is, counterintuitively, the most powerful strategic position in the attention economy. Active attention seeking, advertising, marketing, public relations, is expensive precisely because it is active. You must produce the attention. You must buy the distribution. You must fight for the audience's scarce cognitive resources. BLM did none of this. Its strategic position was that of a gravity well. It did not chase attention. Attention fell toward it, drawn by the cultural and commercial forces that made BLM the focal point of the moment. And because BLM was not spending resources to acquire attention, every dollar of revenue generated from that attention was net revenue. This is the attention arbitrage, the spread between the zero cost of attention acquisition and the full value of attention conversion, minus ActBlue's processing fee. But the media alchemy goes deeper than mere attention economics. There is a mechanism within BLM's media relationship that I call the editorial to commercial conversion pipeline, and it represents a fundamentally new model for how media coverage can be weaponized for fundraising purposes. In the traditional model, earned media coverage helps fundraising indirectly. A positive news story about a candidate increases their credibility, which makes donors more likely to give when subsequently asked. The media coverage and the fundraising ask are separate events, connected by the donor's memory and evaluation. There is a gap, temporal, cognitive, and operational, between seeing the news story and making the donation. BLM collapsed this gap to zero. The mechanism was the hyperlink. Specifically, the donation link embedded in, adjacent to, or immediately accessible from the media content that generated the emotional response. When a news organization published a story about George Floyd's death, the story existed within a digital ecosystem that was saturated with donation links. The reader did not need to remember the story, navigate to a separate website, and consciously decide to donate. The reader could click a link in the article's sidebar, in the social media post that shared the article, in the comment thread below the article, or in the Ways to Help box that many news organizations embedded directly in their coverage. The editorial content and the commercial conversion were not separated by time, space, or cognitive effort. They coexisted in the same digital frame, in the same moment of emotional engagement, accessible through the same interface. This is the editorial to commercial conversion pipeline, the mechanism through which journalistic content, which is produced for informational and commercial purposes by media organizations, becomes, without alteration, the most effective fundraising content ever created. The news story about George Floyd was not designed as a fundraising appeal. It was designed as journalism, but it functioned as a fundraising appeal more effectively than any intentionally designed fundraising content could, because it had qualities that fundraising content cannot replicate. Credibility, it was produced by a trusted news source, not by the organization seeking donations. Emotional power, it depicted real events, not constructed narratives. And ubiquity, it was distributed by the most powerful media organizations in the world, not by a campaign's email list. Here is the dual marketing hack embedded in this mechanism. BLM's most effective fundraising content was content that BLM did not produce, did not commission, did not review, and did not approve. It was content produced by third parties, journalists, citizens with cell phone cameras, social media users, who were pursuing their own informational, social, or commercial objectives. BLM's contribution to this content was existing, being the organization whose name was synonymous with the cause that the content addressed. The content producers did BLM's fundraising for free because they were not aware that they were doing BLM's fundraising. They were covering the news, they were sharing their outrage, they were documenting their experience, and in doing so, they were creating the most effective fundraising campaign in modern history. The fourth mechanism within the media alchemy is what I call manufactured consensus through coverage saturation. This mechanism operates at the intersection of media theory, social psychology, and fundraising strategy, and it is the mechanism that made BLM's fundraising environment qualitatively different from any previous social movements. In media theory, the spiral of silence, first described by Elizabeth Noel Newman, is the phenomenon in which individuals who perceive their opinions to be in the minority suppress those opinions, while individuals who perceive their opinions to be in the majority express them more loudly. The result is a self-reinforcing cycle in which the perceived majority opinion becomes more visible, which causes more people to perceive it as the majority, which causes more people to express it, which makes it more visible, and so on. The spiral of silence does not require that the perceived majority opinion actually is the majority opinion. It only requires that media coverage creates the perception of majority consensus. In the summer of 2020, media coverage of BLM created an overwhelming perception of consensus. Every news outlet, every corporation, every university, every sports league, every cultural institution appeared to support BLM. Dissenting voices were marginal, muted, or absent from mainstream media coverage. The spiral of silence operated at maximum force. Individuals who might have had reservations about BLM, about its specific demands, its organizational structure, its tactics, perceived themselves to be in such a small minority that they suppressed their reservations. And this suppression manifested, in fundraising terms, as giving. Because in an environment of perceived consensus, not giving is a form of dissent. And the spiral of silence makes dissent psychologically costly. This is the mechanism through which media coverage converts not just willing donors, but reluctant donors. The willing donor gives because they want to support the cause. The reluctant donor gives because the cost of not giving, the social risk of being perceived as dissenting from the consensus, exceeds the cost of the donation. Boxscore's fundraising framework addresses willing donors. It focuses on identifying people who are predisposed to give and persuading them to act on that predisposition. BLM's media alchemy addressed a much larger population, people who were not predisposed to give but who gave anyway, because the cultural environment made not giving feel like a public confession of moral failure. This mechanism, the conversion of reluctant donors through manufactured consensus, represents a category of fundraising that has no name in the traditional literature because it has no precedent. It is not persuasion. The donor is not convinced of the cause's merit. It is not coercion. No one is forcing the donor to give. It is something in between, a form of soft compulsion that operates through the social dynamics of perceived consensus. The donor gives not because they have been asked, not because they know how much to give, not because they believe the campaign is winnable, but because the information environment has constructed a reality in which giving is the default behavior, and not giving is a deviation from the norm that requires explanation, justification, and social risk. There is a concept in social psychology called identity fusion, the state in which a person's individual identity becomes so deeply intertwined with a group identity that the boundary between self and group effectively dissolves. Identity fusion is distinct from mere group identification. When you identify with a group, you recognize your membership in it, but you maintain a clear sense of self that exists independently of the group. You can say, I support this cause, but I am not this cause. When you fuse with a group, that separation collapses. The group's fate becomes your fate. The group's enemies become your enemies. The group's cause becomes your purpose. And, critically for our analysis, the group's financial needs become your personal financial obligations, as immediate and non-negotiable as your rent or your grocery bill. Black Lives Matter achieved identity fusion at a scale and speed that no brand, no political campaign, no religion, and no social movement in the modern era has matched. And it achieved this fusion through a mechanism that the marketing and fundraising literature does not have a framework for, because the mechanism operates at a level of psychological depth that marketers typically cannot access, the exploitation of what I call identity debt, the manufactured perception that an individual owes a moral obligation to a cause, not because the cause has given them anything, but because their existing identity commitments demand it. Here is the mechanism, and it requires careful attention because it is the engine of everything that follows and the hidden architecture beneath BLM's entire fundraising operation. In normal brand relationships, the consumer chooses to affiliate with a brand because the brand provides something they want: status, quality, community, self-expression. Nike provides athletic aspiration, Apple provides creative identity, Harley-Davidson provides rebel mythology, Tesla provides environmental virtue. These are voluntary affiliations. The consumer can enter and exit the brand relationship at will, and their core identity remains intact, regardless of whether they buy the product. You can stop buying Nike and still be an athlete. You can stop buying Apple and still be creative. The brand augments the identity. It does not constitute the identity. BLM created a brand relationship that was not voluntary. It was obligatory, and the obligation was not external. It was not imposed by law or force or even direct social pressure. The obligation was internal. It was generated by the person's own existing moral commitments, which BLM's cultural positioning had reconfigured into a debt that could only be repaid through affiliation with the BLM brand. The mechanism works through a 4-stage psychological process that I have never seen articulated in any marketing, fundraising, or social movement literature. Stage 1, moral axiom capture. BLM's name, Black Lives Matter, is not a brand name in the conventional sense. It is a moral axiom. It is a proposition that, within the framework of mainstream American moral discourse, is virtually impossible to reject without placing oneself outside the boundaries of acceptable moral reasoning. This is not accidental. The name was chosen, or evolved, to occupy the specific linguistic territory where a moral axiom and a brand identity overlap. To disagree with Black Lives Matter as a proposition is to disagree with the idea that black lives have intrinsic value. This is a position that almost no one in mainstream American discourse is willing to take publicly. The name thus creates what logicians call a forced move. The listener must either affirm the proposition, and thereby affirm the brand, or refuse to affirm the proposition, and thereby place themselves outside the moral consensus. There is no neutral position. The name eliminates neutrality as an option. This is the first marketing hack. BLM achieved brand adoption without requiring brand preference. In the traditional model, consumers must prefer a brand over alternatives. They must evaluate options, compare features, and choose. BLM's brand did not compete in a market of choices. It occupied the position of a moral prerequisite, something that must be affirmed before any other moral conversation can proceed. You do not choose to affirm that Black Lives Matter any more than you choose to affirm that the sun exists. The proposition positions itself as prior to choice, and by doing so, it positions the brand as prior to choice. Stage 2, obligation derivation. Once the moral axiom is captured, once the individual has affirmed, even silently, that Black Lives Matter, the cultural discourse derives specific obligations from that affirmation. This derivation is performed not by BLM, the organization, but by the cultural environment that BLM's brand inhabits. The derivation follows a logical chain that is never made explicit, but is encoded in thousands of social media posts, think pieces, corporate statements, and interpersonal conversations. A, Black Lives Matter. B, Black lives are currently threatened by systemic racism and police violence. C, if you believe A and acknowledge B, you have a moral obligation to act. D, acting means, at minimum, educating yourself, amplifying black voices, and contributing financially to organizations fighting for racial justice. E, the primary organization fighting for racial justice is Black Lives Matter. Each step in this chain is presented not as an argument to be evaluated, but as an implication to be accepted. The chain is not logically airtight. Step E, in particular, involves a massive leap from a general moral obligation to a specific organizational allegiance, but the emotional velocity of the moment carries the listener through the chain before they have time to evaluate each link. This is the second marketing hack. BLM converted a universal moral commitment into a specific financial obligation through a chain of implied obligations that the cultural environment enforced without BLM having to articulate it. The organization never had to say, if you believe Black Lives Matter, you must donate to us. The culture said it for them through 1,000 intermediaries, influencers, journalists, professors, corporate leaders, friends, family members. each of whom was motivated by their own social incentives to enforce the obligation chain. Stage 3, identity integration. Once the moral axiom is captured and the obligation is derived, the individual begins to integrate the BLM brand into their identity structure. This integration is not a conscious decision. It is a cognitive process driven by the need for psychological consistency. If I believe that Black Lives Matter, and if I have accepted the obligation to support organizations fighting for racial justice, and if I have acted on that obligation by donating to BLM, then my identity must accommodate these beliefs and actions. I am now someone who supports BLM. This is not merely an action I have taken, it is a feature of who I am. And because it is a feature of who I am, it is resistant to change, resistant to counter evidence, and resistant to criticism. To withdraw my support from BLM would not merely be a change in behavior, it would be a change in identity. And identity changes are, psychologically, among the most costly cognitive operations a person can perform. This integration is deepened by every subsequent action that reinforces the BLM identity, every social media post, every conversation in which the person defends BLM, every donation, every protest attendance, every black square posted on Instagram. Each action adds another layer of identity integration, making the BLM brand more central to the person's self-concept and making withdrawal more psychologically expensive. This is the mechanism that Cialdini describes as commitment and consistency, the tendency for people to behave in ways that are consistent with their prior commitments, but operating at a depth that Cialdini's framework does not fully capture. This is not merely consistency with a prior action. This is consistency with a prior identity claim. And identity claims are the most powerful anchors of consistent behavior because they cannot be revised without revising the self. Stage 4, identity debt accumulation. Here is the mechanism that no one has articulated, and it is the mechanism that generates the most revenue and the most enduring brand loyalty. Once BLM is integrated into the person's identity, the person begins to accumulate identity debt, a growing sense that their actual behavior falls short of their identity claim. The person has claimed to support racial justice. They have posted on social media, they have donated, but the scope of racial injustice is vast, and no individual's actions can match the magnitude of the problem they have committed to addressing. This gap between identity claim and actual impact creates a persistent sense of insufficiency, a debt that can never be fully repaid, only temporarily serviced through additional donations, additional posts, additional signals of commitment. This is the revenue-generating mechanism. The identity debt is never satisfied. Every donation provides temporary relief from the sense of insufficiency, but the relief is transient because the underlying gap between identity claim and actual impact persists. The next news cycle, the next viral video, the next cultural conversation about race reactivates the identity debt and creates a new purchase occasion. The donor is not giving once. The donor is paying installments on a debt that grows faster than it can be serviced. And this is the structural mechanism that, in optimal conditions, generates recurring revenue without the organizational investment in donor retention that Buckscore describes as essential. The retention is not generated by the organization's thank you notes, its regular communications, or its personalized follow-up. The retention is generated by the donor's own psychological structure, by the gap between who they claim to be and what they have actually done. Now consider the implications for the traditional fundraising model. Buckscore writes about the importance of thanking donors. Regardless of the amount, always thank your contributors and make sure they feel appreciated. Prompt acknowledgement in the form of personalized letters will help develop a habit of regular giving among your contributors. When asked why they no longer give, the number one reason given is, "I was never thanked." This is excellent advice for the traditional model, in which the donor-organization relationship is bilateral, and the donor's continued giving depends on their satisfaction with the relationship. But in the identity fusion model, thanking the donor is not necessary and might even be counterproductive. Here's why. The thank you note resolves the tension between the donor and the organization. It says, "You have done enough. We appreciate your contribution. You are a good supporter." This resolution, in the identity debt framework, is actually harmful to future revenue because it reduces the sense of insufficiency that drives continued giving. The donor who receives a heartfelt thank you note might think, "I've done my part, I've been acknowledged, I can relax." The donor who receives no acknowledgement remains in a state of identity debt, uncertain whether they have done enough, uncertain whether their contribution mattered, uncertain whether they are truly the person they claim to be. This uncertainty is the revenue engine. It is what drives the next donation. BLM, whether by design or by structural incapacity, provided minimal donor acknowledgement. There were no personalized thank you letters. There were no donor appreciation events. There were no regular communications about how donations were being used. And the result, contrary to what the traditional fundraising model would predict, was not donor attrition. It was continued giving, driven by the unresolved identity debt that the lack of acknowledgement perpetuated. This is the most counterintuitive insight in the entire analysis. In certain conditions, the worst thing a fundraising organization can do is make its donors feel good about their contributions, because donors who feel good stop giving. Donors who feel insufficient keep giving. And the identity fusion model ensures that donors always feel insufficient, because the gap between their identity claim and the magnitude of the problem is permanent and irreducible. Every fundraising professional understands that the infrastructure through which money flows is as important as the money itself. BoxScore devotes substantial attention to the mechanics of processing donations, credit card platforms, compliance reporting, data management, and the critical importance of maintaining clean donor records. She describes the rise of ActBlue and WinRed as transformative platforms that simplified donation processing and enabled one-click giving. But the discussion in Go Fish, like most fundraising literature, treats these platforms as neutral infrastructure, pipes through which money flows from donor to recipient, transparent and inert, shaping the flow only in the mechanical sense of making it faster or slower, smoother or rougher. BLM's fundraising history reveals that this framing is not merely incomplete, it is fundamentally misleading. The pipes are not neutral, they are not transparent, they are not inert. They have their own logic, their own incentive structures, their own capacity to shape the fundraising relationship in ways that neither donors nor, in some cases, the recipient organizations fully understand. And the specific configuration of BLM's fiscal conduit, the chain of entities through which donations passed from donor to ultimate recipient, reveals a structural vulnerability in modern digital philanthropy that has implications far beyond BLM. To understand the fiscal conduit problem, you need to trace the exact path that a dollar took when it was donated to Black Lives Matter during the peak fundraising period of 2020. The path is more complex than any donor realized, and the complexity itself is the mechanism through which accountability was structurally eliminated. Step 1. The donor clicks Donate on the Black Lives Matter website. The donation page is hosted by ActBlue Charities, a 501c3 organization that serves as a charitable donation processing platform. The donor's credit card is charged. ActBlue Charities retains a processing fee, approximately 3.95% of the transaction amount. The donor receives a tax-deductible receipt from ActBlue Charities. Step 2. ActBlue Charities transmits the net donation amount to the designated fiscal sponsor. During BLM's peak fundraising period, through July 2020, the fiscal sponsor was Thousand Currents, a 501c3 international grant-making organization based in Oakland, California. After July 2020, when BLM-GNF obtained its own 501c3 status, the fiscal sponsorship arrangement ended and funds were transmitted to a different entity. The Tides Foundation served briefly as an intermediary during the transition before BLM-GNF received direct deposits. Step 3. The fiscal sponsor holds the funds in a designated account for BLM-GNF. The fiscal sponsor is responsible for ensuring that disbursements comply with IRS regulations governing 501c3 organizations. The fiscal sponsor exercises fiduciary oversight, in theory, over how the funds are used. Step 4. BLM-GNF requests disbursements from the fiscal sponsor for specific purposes. The fiscal sponsor evaluates the request and, if it complies with charitable purposes, authorizes the disbursement. This 4-step process means that a minimum of 3 distinct legal entities were involved in the processing of each donation: ActBlue Charities, the payment processor, Thousand Currents or its successor, the fiscal sponsor, and BLM-GNF, the ultimate recipient. Each entity had its own legal obligations, its own reporting requirements, and its own governance structure. And, crucially, the donor had a direct relationship with none of them except ActBlue Charities, whose role was purely transactional. Now here is the hidden mechanism that this structure created, and it operates at the intersection of information economics and accountability theory in a way that no fundraising analyst has articulated. In information economics, information asymmetry describes a situation in which one party to a transaction has more or better information than the other. Information asymmetries create principal-agent problems. The party with less information, the principal, cannot effectively monitor the party with more information, the agent, creating opportunities for the agent to act in ways that serve their own interests rather than the principal's. BLM's fiscal conduit created a multi-layered information asymmetry that compounded at each step. Layer 1. The donor knew they were giving to Black Lives Matter. They did not know they were giving to ActBlue Charities, which was transmitting funds to Thousand Currents, which was holding funds for BLM-GNF. The donor's mental model of the transaction was, I gave money to BLM. The actual transaction was, I gave money to a payment processor that transmitted it to a fiscal sponsor that held it for an organization that may or may not deploy it in ways I expect. Layer 2. ActBlue Charities knew how much money it processed and where it was transmitted. But ActBlue Charities had no obligation to monitor how the funds were ultimately used by the fiscal sponsor or BLM-GNF. Act Blue's role was transactional. It processed payments, it transmitted funds, it issued receipts. The substantive question of what happened to the money was outside Act Blue's scope of responsibility. Layer 3. Thousand Currents, the fiscal sponsor, had fiduciary oversight of the funds while they were under its custody. But the extent and rigor of this oversight is not publicly documented. Fiscal sponsorship relationships vary enormously in the degree of oversight the sponsor exercises, from hands-on management of every expenditure to rubber-stamping disbursement requests. The donor had no way to know which end of this spectrum applied to BLM's funds. Layer 4. BLM GNF itself, during the period of fiscal sponsorship, did not have its own board of directors in the traditional sense, did not file its own Form 990, the annual IRS filing required of 501c3 organizations, and did not publish independent financial statements. The organization's financial activities were subsumed within the fiscal sponsor's reporting, making independent evaluation of BLM's finances effectively impossible for donors, journalists, or the public. This four-layer information asymmetry meant that $90 million in donations flowed through a system in which no single entity had both the complete information about how the money was used and a direct accountability relationship with the donors who provided it. The donors were accountable to no one they gave voluntarily. Act Blue was accountable to its processing obligations. It transmitted funds correctly. Thousand Currents was accountable to the IRS for its fiscal sponsorship obligations. It maintained 501c3 compliance. BLM GNF was accountable to Thousand Currents within the terms of their fiscal sponsorship agreement. But no entity in this chain was accountable to the donors in the way that Boxscore's fundraising model assumes, the personal, relationship-based accountability in which the donor knows who received their money, how it was spent, and whether it produced the expected results. This is the fiscal conduit problem. The structural elimination of donor accountability through the distribution of fiduciary responsibility across multiple entities, none of which bears the full weight of accountability to the people who provided the funds. And this problem is not unique to BLM. It is a structural feature of the modern digital philanthropic infrastructure, in which payment processors, fiscal sponsors, donor-advised funds, charitable intermediaries, and recipient organizations create chains of intermediation that diffuse accountability to the point of dissolution. But here is the dual marketing hack embedded in this structure, the mechanism that made the fiscal conduit not merely a governance problem, but a fundraising advantage. The complexity of the conduit insulated BLM's fundraising from donor scrutiny during the critical growth period. Because the conduit was complex, donors could not easily evaluate how their money was being used. Because they could not easily evaluate, they could not easily become dissatisfied. And because they could not easily become dissatisfied, they did not stop giving. In Boxscore's model, donor satisfaction is essential to donor retention. The thank you note, the regular communication, the transparent reporting, all of these are mechanisms for maintaining donor satisfaction. But donor satisfaction requires donor information. The donor must know enough about how their money was used to form a judgment about whether they are satisfied. The fiscal conduit deprived donors of this information, not through concealment, but through structural complexity. The information existed somewhere in the chain, but nowhere that the donor could access it, evaluate it, or act on it. This information deprivation had a paradoxical effect on fundraising. It extended the fundraising window. In a transparent system, where donors can see in real time how their money is being used, donor dissatisfaction can emerge quickly, causing donations to slow or stop. In an opaque system, where the complexity of the conduit delays or prevents donor evaluation, dissatisfaction is delayed, and donations continue for longer than they would in a transparent system. BLM's fiscal conduit created a delay between the donation and the donor's ability to evaluate the donation's impact, and this delay, which lasted months, in some cases years, was the period during which the most revenue was generated. Boxscore identifies creating a sense of urgency as one of the fundamental guidelines for successful fundraising. She advises fundraisers to express a critical need for a potential contributor's financial support and suggest time constraints. This is standard practice, and it is grounded in well-established behavioral economics. People are more likely to act when they face a deadline than when the decision can be deferred indefinitely. The fundraising industry has developed an entire repertoire of urgency creation techniques: FEC, reporting deadlines, matching gift challenges, limited time offers, election day countdowns, crisis appeals, and end-of-year giving campaigns. All of these are forms of manufactured urgency, artificial deadlines designed to accelerate the donor's decision-making process and override the natural tendency to procrastinate. BLM had no need for manufactured urgency, and this fact alone reveals a structural hierarchy within urgency-based fundraising that the traditional literature has never articulated. There are at least 3 distinct tiers of fundraising urgency, and they differ not merely in degree, but in kind. Tier 1, procedural urgency. This is the urgency of deadlines, quotas, and reporting periods. We need to raise $50,000 by midnight to hit our FEC goal. This urgency is entirely artificial. It is created by the organization and has no intrinsic connection to the donor's life, values, or emotional state. Procedural urgency works because it creates a temporal constraint that converts a should I give Poisson question into a should I give now question. But it is the weakest form of urgency because the donor knows at some level that the deadline is arbitrary. Missing an FEC reporting deadline does not change the world. It changes a number on a report. Procedural urgency generates action through mild cognitive pressure, the same mechanism that drives limited time offers in retail. It is effective, but shallow. Tier 2, consequential urgency. This is the urgency of impending outcomes, elections, legislation, judicial decisions, where the donor's contribution can plausibly influence a concrete result. If we don't raise $100,000 this week, we can't run our ads before the vote. Consequential urgency is stronger than procedural urgency because it connects the donation to a real-world outcome that the donor cares about. The donor is not merely meeting a deadline, they are preventing a bad outcome or enabling a good one, but consequential urgency is still mediated by the donor's belief that their contribution will make a difference, a belief that is increasingly difficult to sustain as the donor's contribution becomes a smaller fraction of the total campaign budget. Does my $50 really determine whether the ads run? Probably not. Tier 3, existential urgency. This is the urgency of perceived moral crisis, the feeling that the foundational values of one's society are under threat, and that failure to act constitutes a betrayal of those values. BLM operated exclusively at this tier. The urgency was not about a deadline or an outcome, it was about the donor's relationship to their own moral identity. The question was not, will we hit our goal, or will the ads run? The question was, what kind of person am I if I do nothing while people are dying? The fundraising implications of this three-tier hierarchy are profound, because each tier operates on a different psychological mechanism and generates a different quality of donor response. Procedural urgency operates on the mechanism of temporal discounting, the tendency for people to value immediate options more than deferred options. The FEC deadline makes give now more valuable than give later by creating a temporal boundary. The donor's response is calculated. They weigh the cost of giving now against the cost of missing the deadline, which is functionally zero for the individual donor. The response rate is moderate, and the average gift is determined by the donor's pre-existing assessment of how much the campaign deserves. Consequential urgency operates on the mechanism of loss aversion, the tendency for people to be more motivated by the prospect of losing something than by the prospect of gaining something of equal value. The impending election or vote creates a potential loss, the bad outcome, that the donation can avert. The donor's response is more emotional than procedural urgency, but still tethered to a cognitive assessment of probability. The response rate is higher and the average gift may be larger, but both are constrained by the donor's assessment of whether their contribution will actually make a difference. Existential urgency operates on neither of these mechanisms. It operates on the mechanism of identity threat, the perception that one's moral self-concept is at risk. Identity threat is the most powerful motivator in the psychological literature because it targets the deepest layer of human motivation, the need to maintain a coherent, positive self-concept. When a person's identity is threatened, when they face the possibility that they are not the person they believe themselves to be, the response is not calculated or deliberative. It is immediate, visceral, and disproportionate to the objective circumstances. People who would not give $50 to meet an FEC deadline will give $500 in response to an identity threat, because the FEC deadline threatens a campaign and the identity threat threatens the self. BLM's existential urgency was not manufactured by the organization. It was manufactured by the convergence of a specific set of conditions: a viral video depicting a man's death at the hands of police, occurring during a pandemic that had confined millions of people to their homes with unlimited access to social media, in a political environment already polarized along racial lines, amplified by media organizations competing for the attention of a captive audience, and interpreted through a cultural framework that had been primed by 6 years of BLM activism to understand police violence as a systemic, structural, ongoing moral crisis rather than an isolated incident. Each of these conditions contributed to the existential urgency, and the compound effect was multiplicative, not additive. The video alone would have been disturbing. The video during a pandemic, when people had time and emotional bandwidth to engage, was devastating. The video during a pandemic, amplified by algorithms designed to maximize engagement, was inescapable. The video during a pandemic, amplified by algorithms, interpreted through the BLM framework of systemic racism, became an existential crisis, a moment in which every person was forced to confront the question of whether their society was fundamentally unjust and whether their silence constituted complicity. This existential urgency had properties that no manufactured urgency can replicate. First, it was self-renewing. Each new incident of police violence, and these incidents are statistically frequent, regenerated the urgency without any organizational effort. Boxscore describes the importance of repeated appeals, giving every potential donor the opportunity to contribute through multiple solicitations over time. BLM's urgency cycle made repeated appeals unnecessary because the news cycle was the appeal. Each new incident was a new solicitation, delivered not by the organization but by the media at zero cost. Second, the existential urgency was resistant to habituation. Manufactured urgency fades quickly. The match expires at midnight. Email generates decreasing response rates with each repetition because donors learn that another deadline is always coming. Existential urgency operates on a deeper psychological substrate that is resistant to habituation because it is connected to real events, not artificial deadlines, and to the donor's identity, not their calendar. The donor who gives in response to George Floyd's death does not become habituated to the urgency of police violence. If anything, their identity integration, discussed in Section 4, makes them more responsive to subsequent incidents, because their identity as someone who cares about racial justice is now activated and must be maintained through continued giving. Third, and this is the mechanism that makes existential urgency structurally different from all other forms, existential urgency eliminates the ask. In Boxscore's model, the fundraiser must ask for money. The ask is the essential act of fundraising. Without the ask, no money flows. But existential urgency makes the ask redundant because the donor's identity threat generates the ask internally. The donor does not need to be asked to give. The donor asks themselves. And the self-generated ask is infinitely more powerful than any external ask because it cannot be declined, deferred, or dismissed. You can ignore a fundraising email. You can hang up on a telemarketer. You can walk past a ticket seller. You cannot ignore the voice inside your own head that says, if you don't do something, you are complicit in the very injustice you claim to oppose. That voice is the most effective fundraiser ever deployed, and BLM did not create it. The cultural environment created it. BLM merely provided the donation page where the voice could be answered. One of the most counterintuitive insights in BLM's fundraising history is that its organizational decentralization, which by any traditional governance standard was a catastrophic liability, a failure of basic organizational design, functioned as a fundraising superpower of such extraordinary magnitude that it calls into question the fundamental assumptions of organizational theory as applied to capital formation. Boxscore's fundraising framework assumes organizational coherence as a prerequisite for fundraising success. The finance plan requires a campaign manager, a finance director, a finance chair, and a finance committee, all operating in coordination, all accountable to the same plan, all working toward the same goals with the same deadlines. The pack kit requires a campaign profile that includes the names and bios of key team members and a brief and generic outline of the budget. The event planning process requires centralized coordination of invitations, logistics, speakers, and follow-up. Every element of the traditional fundraising model presupposes that there is a single, identifiable organization with a clear chain of command that is responsible for raising, receiving, managing, and deploying the funds. This presupposition is so deeply embedded in the fundraising literature that it is never stated. It is simply assumed, the way a fish assumes water. BLM defied this presupposition so thoroughly that it revealed the presupposition itself to be an artifact of an earlier information environment, one in which organizations needed centralized structures to achieve coordinated action because coordination required centralized communication channels. In the pre-internet era, the only way to coordinate thousands of people toward a common goal was through hierarchical organization, leaders at the top, managers in the middle, workers at the bottom, information flowing up and down through established channels. This hierarchical model worked for political campaigns because campaigns are fundamentally coordination problems, the problem of getting thousands of people to do specific things at specific times in specific ways. And centralized coordination solves this problem efficiently, but fundraising in the digital era is not a coordination problem. It is a propagation problem. The question is not, how do we get thousands of people to do the right thing at the right time? The question is, how do we create the conditions under which millions of people spontaneously do the thing we need them to do? These are categorically different problems, and they require categorically different organizational structures. Coordination problems are solved by hierarchy. Propagation problems are solved by networks. And BLM was, above all else, a network. The fundraising advantages of BLM's network structure were not merely tactical. They were structural. They arose from the mathematical and sociological properties of networks themselves, and they would have existed regardless of BLM's specific organizational decisions. Network advantage. 1. Anti-fragility. Nassim Taleb's concept of anti-fragility describes systems that gain strength from disorder, systems that do not merely resist shocks, but are improved by them. BLM's decentralized brand was anti-fragile in the fundraising context. When critics attacked BLM Global Network Foundation for financial opacity, the broader BLM brand was not damaged. It was strengthened, because the criticism activated the identity fusion mechanism, discussed in Section 4, among existing supporters, who experienced the criticism as an attack on their own identity and responded by donating more, sharing more, and defending the brand more aggressively. When local BLM chapters had internal disputes or governance failures, the national brand was unaffected because no single chapter was identified with the brand as a whole. When opponents attempted to discredit BLM by associating it with specific controversial statements or actions, the decentralized structure made such associations impossible to sustain, because BLM was not a single entity that could be held responsible for the actions of any individual or affiliate. In the traditional fundraising model, organizational failure is a fundraising crisis. If a campaign's finance chair is caught in a scandal, the campaign's fundraising is imperiled. If a nonprofit's CEO is exposed for mismanagement, donations decline. The centralized organization creates a single point of accountability that, when it fails, damages the entire enterprise. BLM's decentralized structure eliminated the single point of accountability, and in doing so, eliminated the single point of failure. The brand could survive any individual organizational failure because the brand was not dependent on any individual organization. Network advantage. 2. Infinite scalability of the sales force. Boxscore writes extensively about the importance of recruiting ticket sellers and finance committee members to serve as the campaign's sales force. She recommends recruiting by occupation, by region, and by interest area, and she emphasizes the importance of setting achievable goals, holding regular meetings, and maintaining motivation through incentives and competition. All of this advice is excellent, and it is all constrained by the fundamental limitation of centralized volunteer management. You can only manage as many volunteers as your organizational capacity allows. A finance committee of 20 requires a finance chair who can manage 20 relationships. A ticket-selling committee of 50 requires a staff member who can coordinate 50 people. The organizational overhead of volunteer management imposes a ceiling on the sales force. BLM had no such ceiling. Its sales force, the millions of individuals who shared donation links on social media, was not recruited, not managed, not trained, not motivated by the organization, and not constrained by organizational capacity. These individuals, self-organized, driven by the social dynamics of the moment rather than by organizational direction. And the scale of this self-organized sales force was orders of magnitude larger than anything a managed finance committee could achieve. Here is the hidden mechanism. BLM's decentralized sales force did not merely replicate the function of a traditional finance committee at larger scale. It performed a qualitatively different function. A traditional finance committee member makes a personal appeal. They call their contacts, attend events, send personalized emails. The appeal is high-touch and bilateral. The committee member speaks to the prospect responds. This bilateral dynamic is what makes committee-based solicitation effective. Personal appeals are hard to refuse, but also what makes it expensive. Each appeal requires individual effort. BLM's decentralized sales force made broadcast appeals. They posted on social media, reaching hundreds or thousands of people simultaneously. These appeals were low-touch and unilateral. The poster broadcast a message, and the audience responded or didn't without any bilateral interaction. But the broadcast appeals had a property that bilateral appeals cannot match: social proof multiplication. When a person posted a donation link on their Instagram story, the message was not merely "please donate." The message was, "I donated, and 200 people in my network can see that I donated, and you can see that they can see, and they can see that you can see." This cascading visibility created a social pressure field that operated on every person in the network simultaneously, a distributed parallel solicitation that no centralized sales force could replicate. Network advantage. 3. Brand meaning diversification. In the traditional model, the organization controls its brand meaning. The campaign decides what it stands for, and the finance committee communicates that message consistently. Brand consistency is a virtue. It ensures that every prospect hears the same value proposition and can make an informed decision about whether to give. BLM's decentralized brand was not consistent. It was polymorphic. It meant different things to different people, and this polymorphism was a fundraising advantage of enormous power. For some donors, BLM meant police reform. For others, it meant community investment. For others, it meant anti-racism in the broadest sense. For others, it meant black empowerment. For others, it meant solidarity with a specific cultural moment. For others, it meant opposition to Trump. For others, it meant personal guilt resolution. The brand accommodated all of these meanings simultaneously because no central authority defined the brand's meaning. This polymorphism maximized the potential donor pool in a way that brand consistency cannot. A consistent brand excludes everyone who disagrees with its specific proposition. "We support defunding the police" excludes donors who support police reform but oppose defunding. "We support community investment" excludes donors who want concrete policy reform. "We support Black empowerment" excludes donors who frame their support in colorblind universalist terms. But a polymorphic brand, one that can mean any of these things to any individual donor, excludes almost no one. The donor projects their own meaning onto the brand, and the brand accepts every projection. This is the fundraising advantage of definitional ambiguity. The less precisely a brand defines itself, the more people can see themselves in it, and the more people who see themselves in it, the more people who will give. This mechanism has a specific technical name in marketing theory: brand openness. An open brand is one that allows consumers to co-create its meaning through their own interpretations and uses. Open brands are more resilient, more adaptable, and, thus critically for our analysis, more capable of sustaining mass engagement across diverse populations. BLM was the most open brand in fundraising history because it provided maximum interpretive latitude with minimum definitional constraint. 3 words, 1 moral axiom, infinite personal meanings, and each personal meaning was a personal reason to give. The fundraising literature treats donor psychology as a matter of motivation and persuasion. You identify what motivates people to give, and you craft your appeal to activate those motivations. Box score lists the major reasons people donate: friendship, habit, reward, access, policy change, fear, covering political bases, and being asked, and suggests that a good fundraising plan factors into all of them. This is sound advice for traditional fundraising, and it represents the industry standard model of donor psychology. People give for identifiable reasons, and the fundraiser's job is to understand and activate those reasons through targeted communication. BLM's fundraising operated on a psychological register so different from this standard model that the standard model cannot explain it. The standard model is a rational choice model dressed in psychological clothing. It assumes that donors evaluate propositions, weigh costs and benefits, and make decisions based on a combination of self-interest and altruism. The reasons box score lists, friendship, habit, reward, access, etc., are all evaluable reasons. The donor can ask, "Am I friends with this candidate? Do I habitually give to campaigns? Will I get access to the candidate?" These are questions that can be answered through deliberation. BLM's fundraising was not deliberative. It was reflexive. It operated on psychological mechanisms that bypass the evaluative process entirely and produce giving behavior through automatic, preconscious, cognitive processes. To understand these mechanisms, you need a model of donor psychology that is grounded not in the rational choice framework of traditional fundraising, but in the cognitive science of threat response, group identity, and moral emotion. Here are the 5 mechanisms, articulated with a level of technical specificity that the fundraising literature has never attempted. Mechanism 1, mortality salience and worldview defense. Terror management theory, TMT, developed by Solomon, Greenberg, and Pischinsky, is one of the most extensively validated frameworks in experimental social psychology. TMT proposes that awareness of one's own mortality, when made psychologically salient through reminders of death, produces a specific pattern of psychological responses: increased identification with one's cultural worldview, increased positive evaluation of in-group members, increased negative evaluation of out-group members, and increased engagement in behaviors that bolster self-esteem. These responses are not conscious strategies for coping with death anxiety. They are automatic, preconscious, defensive reactions that operate below the threshold of deliberative awareness. The George Floyd video was, at the most basic level, a mortality salience induction of unprecedented scale. Millions of people watched a man die. For Black Americans, the video activated mortality salience with extreme specificity. It was a reminder of a specific threat to their physical survival. For non-Black Americans, the video activated mortality salience more broadly. It was a confrontation with death, suffering, and the fragility of human life. TMT predicts that this mortality salience would increase engagement in worldview defending behaviors, and donating to BLM was, within the cultural framework of the moment, the preeminent worldview defending behavior available. The donation was not merely a financial transaction, it was a death anxiety management strategy, a way to impose meaning and moral order on a world that had just demonstrated its capacity for arbitrary violence. Here is the hidden mechanism within the mechanism. TMT research has demonstrated that mortality salience increases not only the intensity of worldview defense, but also the monetary valuation of worldview consistent behavior. Studies have shown that people primed with mortality salience are willing to pay more for products that affirm their cultural worldview and less for products that threaten it. This means that the mortality salience induced by the Floyd video did not merely increase the probability of giving, it increased the amount of each gift. Donors primed by the video were willing to give more than they would have given in a non-mortality salient condition because the higher gift amount provided greater worldview defense and therefore greater death anxiety management. Mechanism 2, moral cleansing through compensatory virtue. The psychological literature on moral self-regulation demonstrates that people maintain a subjective moral balance sheet, an ongoing, largely unconscious accounting of their virtuous and non-virtuous behaviors. When the balance sheet tilts toward the non-virtuous side, when a person perceives that they have done something morally questionable or failed to do something morally required, they experience moral dissonance, a form of psychological discomfort that motivates compensatory virtuous behavior. This compensatory behavior cleanses the moral balance sheet and restores psychological equilibrium. BLM's cultural positioning created moral dissonance on a massive scale through a mechanism that I call retroactive guilt implication. The discourse of systemic racism, which BLM both promoted and benefited from, reframed the moral balance sheet of every person who had participated in American society without actively opposing racial injustice. The framing said, in effect, your passive participation in a racist system has generated moral debt. You did not know you were accumulating this debt, but you were. And now that you know the debt is due, this retroactive guilt implication was extraordinarily effective as a fundraising mechanism because it created moral dissonance in people who had never personally committed a racist act and who had never previously considered themselves morally deficient in the domain of racial justice. The guilt was not personal. It was structural. It was not based on anything the donor had done. It was based on the donor's membership in a social system that produced racially disparate outcomes. And because the guilt was structural rather than personal, it could not be resolved through personal behavior change. For example, I'll be nicer to my black neighbors. It could only be resolved through systemic action, and the most accessible form of systemic action available to the average person was donating to BLM. The fundraising power of moral cleansing through compensatory virtue lies in its asymmetry. The guilt is infinite, systemic racism is vast and ongoing, but the cleansing act is finite. The donation is a specific amount at a specific time. This means that the donation can never fully resolve the guilt. It can only temporarily reduce it. The moral balance sheet is never zeroed out. It is only brought closer to zero for a moment before the ongoing system regenerates the debt. This is the mechanism that produces repeat giving without organizational solicitation. The donor gives, feels temporarily cleansed, and then the next news story, the next social media post, the next casual conversation about race regenerates the moral dissonance and creates a new purchase occasion. Mechanism 3, social proof cascade and informational conformity. Robert Cialdini's principle of social proof, the tendency for people to determine correct behavior by observing what others do, is well known in the fundraising literature. But Cialdini's framework, as typically applied, describes social proof as a persuasion technique that fundraisers can deploy. When you include testimonials from satisfied donors in your appeal, you are using social proof. This tactical application dramatically understates the power of social proof when it operates not as a persuasion technique, but as a social environment. In the summer of 2020, social proof was not a technique used by BLM. It was the atmosphere in which BLM existed. Every social media feed was saturated with evidence that other people were supporting BLM, donating, posting, protesting, educating themselves. This saturation created what social psychologists call informational conformity, the tendency to adopt the behavior of others, not because of social pressure, but because the behavior of others provides information about what is correct. In ambiguous situations, and the summer of 2020 was, for many Americans, profoundly ambiguous, informational conformity becomes the dominant decision-making heuristic. People did not donate to BLM because they were pressured. They donated because the observed behavior of millions of other people provided a clear informational signal. Donating is the correct response. But here is the mechanism within the mechanism that no one has articulated. The social proof cascade in BLM's context operated through what I call visibility asymmetry. In a social media environment, giving is visible and not giving is invisible. When a person donates and shares their donation, the act is publicly broadcast. When a person does not donate, there is no corresponding broadcast, no "I chose not to give" post that their network can observe. This visibility asymmetry means that social proof operates in only one direction. It increases the perceived prevalence of giving without providing any counterbalancing evidence of not giving. The result is a systematic overestimation of the proportion of one's network that is donated, which increases the informational conformity pressure to donate. This visibility asymmetry also explains why BLM's social proof cascade was resistant to the bystander effect, the well-known phenomenon in which the presence of many observers reduces each individual's likelihood of helping. The bystander effect operates through diffusion of responsibility. Someone else will help, so I don't need to. But the visibility asymmetry of social media subverts the bystander effect because each person can see not just that others are present, which diffuses responsibility, but that others are acting, which concentrates responsibility. The social proof does not say, many people could give. It says, Chico, many people are giving. This shifts the informational signal from responsibility is shared to giving is the norm, and norms are far more powerful motivators than responsibility diffusion is a demotivator. Mechanism 4, the identifiable victim effect. amplified by narrative transportation, and embodied simulation. The identifiable victim effect, the finding that people give more generously to identified specific victims than to statistical aggregates, is well documented in the charitable giving literature. Paul Slovik's work has shown that a single identified victim generates more empathy, more emotional response, and more charitable giving than millions of unidentified victims. This is the psychic numbing phenomenon. As the number of victims increases, the emotional response per victim decreases. George Floyd was, in fundraising terms, the most effective identifiable victim in the history of charitable giving. But the mechanism was not merely identification. It was embodied simulation, the neurological process through which observing another person's experience activates the same neural circuits that would be activated by having the experience oneself. Mirror neuron research and fMRI studies of empathy have demonstrated that watching someone in pain activates the pain matrix in the observer's brain, not to the same degree as experiencing pain directly, but enough to produce genuine physiological distress. The Floyd video was 9 minutes and 29 seconds of embodied simulation at maximum intensity. Every viewer's brain was simulating, at some level, the experience of having a knee on their neck. Every viewer's respiratory system was activating sympathetic responses to the visible asphyxiation on screen. This was not sympathy, the cognitive appreciation that someone else is suffering. This was empathy at its most visceral, the physiological co-experiencing of another person's suffering. And the fundraising research is clear. Empathic distress is the strongest predictor of charitable giving, not sympathy, not cognitive evaluation, not moral reasoning. Empathic distress, the physical experience of another person's pain, is what opens wallets. Mechanism 5, coalitional signaling under perceived observation and the costly signal dynamic. The final mechanism is the one that ties all the others together and explains why BLM's fundraising was not merely large, but specifically large in the way it was, concentrated in time, concentrated in visible giving, and concentrated among populations whose social environments made giving most visible. Humans evolved as coalitional creatures. Our survival in ancestral environments depended on our ability to form, maintain, and signal loyalty to coalitions. Coalitional loyalty signals had to be costly to be credible. If loyalty could be signaled for free, everyone would signal it, and the signal would carry no information. The donation to BLM was a costly signal of coalitional loyalty. It cost real money, and it could be publicly verified through the shareable donation receipt. But here is the mechanism that makes the costly signal dynamic particularly powerful in the social media environment. The cost of the signal is visible, and the cost of not signaling is also visible through absence from the signaling behavior that everyone else is engaging in. This dual visibility creates a signaling arms race in which each person's donation raises the implicit standard for everyone in their network, prompting larger donations, more frequent donations, and more visible donations. The $25 donor sees their friend give $100 and feels their signal is inadequate. The $100 donor sees their colleague give $500 and feels their signal is inadequate. The escalation is driven not by the organization's ask, but by the donor's perception of what their network considers an adequate signal. This coalitional signaling dynamic explains a phenomenon that the traditional fundraising model cannot. Why BLM's average donation was higher than the typical digital average for political campaigns. In Boxscore's model, the average donation for a political campaign is approximately $35, and the average donation for a digital appeal is in the range of 1 or 0.2% response rate at modest amounts. BLM's average donation was in the range of $30 to $50, at the high end of the typical range, despite having no personalized solicitation, no specific ask amount, and no donor relationship management. The coalitional signaling dynamic explains this premium. Donors were giving not the amount that the organization asked for, it didn't ask for a specific amount, but the amount that their social environment demanded as an adequate signal of coalitional loyalty. And the social environment, being visible and competitive, demanded more than the minimum. These 5 mechanisms, mortality salience, moral cleansing, social proof cascade, the identifiable victim effect with embodied simulation, and coalitional signaling under perceived observation, operated simultaneously, synergistically, and in a self-reinforcing configuration that amplified each mechanism's individual effect. Mortality salience increased the intensity of all subsequent responses. Moral cleansing created a need that social proof defined the correct response to. The identifiable victim effect provided the emotional fuel that powered the coalitional signaling dynamic. And the coalitional signaling dynamic made the giving behavior visible, which fed back into the social proof cascade, which reinforced the informational conformity, which increased the moral pressure, which reactivated the mortality salience. This is the cognitive architecture of tribal enrollment, a multi-mechanism psychological system in which each component reinforces every other component, creating a compound effect that is not merely the sum of individual mechanisms, but their product. And this compound effect is why BLM's fundraising was not merely large, but why it was large in a way that no prior model could have predicted, because no prior model accounts for the simultaneous operation of 5 distinct psychological mechanisms in a self-reinforcing configuration at civilizational scale. Botchkor's fundraising manual does not address corporate giving in the context of social movements for a simple reason. In the traditional political fundraising model, corporations do not give to movements. They give to candidates through PACs, to parties through various legal channels, and to causes through corporate philanthropy programs with established evaluation criteria, application processes, and reporting requirements. Each of these channels ensures that the corporation maintains sovereignty over its philanthropic decisions. It decides how much to give, to whom, under what conditions, and with what expectations of return. The corporation is the principal, the recipient is the agent, the power asymmetry is clear and consistent. BLM shattered this power asymmetry so completely that it revealed a hidden dynamic in the relationship between social movements and corporate capital that has no name in the fundraising literature, no framework in corporate strategy, and no precedent in the history of corporate philanthropy. In the summer of 2020, corporations did not give to BLM-aligned causes because they evaluated the cause and found it worthy. They gave because the cost of not giving exceeded the cost of giving. And the cost of not giving was determined not by the organization's merit, but by the corporation's vulnerability to reputational damage in a social media environment that made non-giving conspicuous. The total corporate commitments to racial justice causes in the wake of George Floyd's death exceeded $50 billion in public pledges, according to tracking by the Washington Post and Creative Investment Research. This number requires contextualization. The entire annual budget of the United States Department of Justice is approximately $38 billion. The entire annual philanthropic giving of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is approximately $5 billion. American corporations pledged, in a matter of weeks, an amount larger than the annual budget of the federal agency responsible for civil rights enforcement, and 10 times the annual giving of the world's largest private philanthropy. And they did so with virtually no organizational solicitation from BLM, no PAC kit, no finance committee, no donor cultivation, and no formal ask. The mechanism through which this extraction occurred is what I call the reputational hostage dynamic, RHD, and understanding it requires a framework that sits at the intersection of game theory, corporate strategy, social media dynamics, and what I call reputational market microstructure. The RHD operates through a specific game theoretic structure that can be modeled as a coordination game with asymmetric payoffs and imperfect information. Here is the model. Players, N corporations in a given industry or peer group. Strategies. Each corporation can either A, make a public statement and financial commitment aligned with BLM, or B, remain silent. Payoffs. The payoff structure is asymmetric and depends on the proportion of other corporations that choose strategy. A. If most corporations remain silent, the cost of silence for any individual corporation is low. No one is conspicuous. If some corporations make commitments, the cost of silence for remaining corporations increases. Silence becomes conspicuous by contrast. If most corporations make commitments, the cost of silence for the remaining holdouts becomes catastrophic. Silence is interpreted as active opposition. This payoff structure creates a classic tipping dynamic. Once a critical mass of corporations adopt strategy A, the cost of strategy B increases for all remaining corporations, pushing more of them towards strategy A, which further increases the cost of strategy B for the ever-shrinking group of holdouts. The equilibrium is universal adoption of strategy A, which is, in fact, what happened. By June 2020, virtually every major American corporation had made some form of public commitment to racial justice. But the game theory alone does not explain the speed and scale of the corporate response. To understand those, you need to add 3 mechanisms that the standard game theoretic model does not capture. Mechanism 1, the employee ultimatum. In knowledge economy industries, technology, finance, media, consulting, legal services, employees are not merely labor inputs. They are the organization's primary asset, and their retention is the organization's primary strategic concern. In the summer of 2020, employees in these industries used internal communication channels to issue what were, functionally, ultimatums. If the company does not publicly support BLM and make a financial commitment, I will leave/publicly criticize the company/organize a walkout/refuse to recruit. These ultimatums were credible because the labor market in knowledge economy industries was tight, because the employees making the ultimatums were often high-value talent, and because the social dynamics within these companies made it difficult for management to dismiss the demands as unrepresentative. The employee ultimatum added an internal pressure channel to the external pressure of social media scrutiny. The corporation was now facing a two-front reputational war, externally against the social media environment that made silence conspicuous, and internally against its own workforce, which interpreted silence as a values failure. The financial commitment to BLM was, for many corporations, the cheapest available resolution to this two-front conflict, far cheaper than employee attrition, recruitment difficulty, internal culture disruption, or public employee criticism. Mechanism 2, the competitive signaling ratchet. Once the first corporations in a given industry made public commitments, those commitments established a benchmark against which all subsequent commitments were evaluated. The first technology company to pledge $10 million set the standard for the industry. The second company had to match or exceed that pledge to avoid appearing less committed. The third company, seeing two competitors at $10 million, might pledge $15 million to differentiate. Each successive commitment ratcheted the benchmark upward, creating an escalation dynamic in which the size of commitments grew not in proportion to the corporation's assessment of the cause's impact, but in proportion to the competitive signaling pressure within the industry. This competitive signaling ratchet explains why the total corporate commitments reached $50 billion, a number that bears no relationship to any plausible assessment of what BLM, or the broader racial justice ecosystem, could productively absorb or deploy. The $50 billion was not a response to need. It was a product of competitive dynamics, in which each corporation's commitment was calibrated not against the cause's requirements, but against its competitors' commitments. The cause was, in economic terms, the pretext for a corporate signaling competition that would have produced large commitments regardless of the specific cause, provided the cause had sufficient cultural salience to make non-commitment costly. Mechanism 3, the reputational insurance mechanism. For many corporations, the commitment to BLM was not primarily an act of philanthropy or solidarity. It was an act of reputational insurance, a payment made to reduce the probability of a costly reputational event, boycott, protest, social media campaign, employee action, that might otherwise target the corporation. Insurance payments are not evaluated on the basis of whether the insured event is likely to occur. They are evaluated on the basis of the expected cost of the insured event multiplied by its probability minus the cost of the insurance premium. For a Fortune 500 company with a brand value in the billions, even a small probability of a reputational event that could destroy 1 to 2% of brand value justifies a commitment of tens of millions of dollars. The BLM commitment was, for many corporations, an actuarially rational insurance purchase, a small, certain cost that eliminated a large, uncertain risk. This reputational insurance mechanism explains a phenomenon that many observers found puzzling. Corporations with poor track records on racial diversity made some of the largest commitments. Companies with predominantly white leadership teams, companies that had been criticized for discriminatory practices, companies with no history of racial justice philanthropy, these companies often made the largest and most public commitments. In the traditional philanthropic model, this would be paradoxical. Why would a company with a poor track record on the very issue it is pledging to address make the largest commitment? The reputational insurance model provides the answer. Companies with the worst track records had the highest reputational exposure and therefore the highest insurance premium. Their large commitments were not evidence of sincere commitment to racial justice. They were evidence of the severity of their reputational vulnerability. Now here is the dual marketing hack that no one has articulated. BLM did not need to approach these corporations. It did not need to send a PAC kit. It did not need to schedule meetings. It did not need to prepare candidates for questions. The cultural dynamics performed the solicitation, the social media environment performed the follow-up, and the reputational consequences of non-compliance performed the closing. This is the most extreme form of what Boxscore describes as being asked, except that the ask did not come from BLM. It came from the corporation's own employees, its own customers, its own shareholders, its own social media followers, and its own competitive peers. BLM was the beneficiary of a distributed solicitation campaign that no organization could have orchestrated because it arose spontaneously from the convergence of cultural, social, and economic pressures that no single actor controlled. The corporate extraction protocol reveals something fundamental about power in the modern attention economy. The entity that controls the cultural narrative does not need to solicit funds directly. It needs only to establish a moral framework in which non-contribution is reputationally costly. The funds will flow as a consequence of the framework, not because anyone asked, but because everyone calculated. Everything described in the preceding 9 sections, the architecture of grievance capital, the donor pyramid inversion, the media alchemy, identity fusion, the fiscal conduit infrastructure, the urgency manufacturing engine, the decentralized brand paradox, the cognitive architecture of tribal enrollment, and the corporate extraction protocol, constitutes a system. And like any system, it can be decomposed into principles, abstracted from its original context, and examined for redeployment across domains. This section does not argue that BLM's specific conditions can be replicated. They cannot, because they arose from a unique convergence of historical, cultural, technological, and political factors. What this section argues is that the mechanisms BLM activated are not unique to BLM. They are features of human psychology, media architecture, and digital infrastructure that exist independently of any particular cause. The following 12 deployment vectors represent the abstracted, generalized, and technically specified principles that any brand, product, movement, or organization can study and, in appropriate conditions, activate. Vector 1, the moral axiom name. BLM's name, Black Lives Matter, is the single most important marketing decision in the history of social movements, and its power derives from a specific linguistic structure that can be identified and replicated. The name is a moral axiom disguised as a brand name. It positions disagreement with the brand as disagreement with a universal moral principle. This structure, brand name equals moral axiom, creates forced adoption. The target audience cannot reject the brand without rejecting the principle, and the principle is one that virtually no one in the target audience is willing to publicly reject. The deployment principle is, name your brand, product, or movement in a way that makes disagreement with it morally untenable. This is not the same as making the name morally positive. Many brands have positive names that can be easily rejected. Hope for Tomorrow, Better Future Foundation. It is about making the name a proposition that the target audience already believes and cannot disavow without social cost. The test is, can a person publicly say, I disagree with brand name, without placing themselves outside the moral consensus of their social environment? If no, you have a moral axiom name. If yes, your name is merely descriptive. Specific application, a climate movement named Clean Air for Children is merely descriptive. A person can oppose the organization without opposing the principle. A climate movement named Children Deserve to Breathe is closer to a moral axiom. Disagreeing with the organization requires appearing to disagree with the proposition that children deserve to breathe. The distinction is subtle, but the fundraising implications are massive. The moral axiom name converts passive agreement with a principle into implicit endorsement of an organization, and implicit endorsement is the precondition for giving. Vector 2, the identity debt manufacturing process. The most powerful fundraising proposition is not one that offers the donor a benefit. It is one that makes not giving feel like a betrayal of the donor's own self-concept. The deployment process has 4 steps. Step 1, identify a moral principle that your target audience already holds but does not actively practice. For BLM, the principle that racial equality is important. For a climate organization, the principle that environmental stewardship matters. For an education nonprofit, the principle that every child deserves a good education. The principle must be one that the audience holds sincerely but acts on inconsistently. Step 2, make the gap between the audience's stated principle and their actual behavior visible and psychologically salient. For BLM, the cultural discourse made the gap between I believe in equality and I have not actively opposed inequality psychologically painful. For other contexts, this can be achieved through content, storytelling, data visualization, or personal testimonials that highlight the gap between intention and action. Step 3, position your organization as the bridge between the audience's stated principle and their actual behavior. For BLM, donating to BLM was the simplest available way to close the gap between I believe in equality and I am actively opposing inequality. For other contexts, the donation or purchase must be positioned as the minimum viable action that converts the audience's principle into practice. Step 4, ensure that the identity debt is never fully resolved, that the gap between principle and practice can never be completely closed through any single action. For BLM, the scope of systemic racism ensured that no individual donation could resolve the moral debt. For other contexts, the key is to connect the donation to a problem that is large enough that no individual contribution can solve it, creating a permanent purchase occasion driven by permanent insufficiency. Vector 3, the zero-cost acquisition engine. BLM's donor acquisition cost approached 0 because the information environment performed the acquisition for free. The deployment principle is not get free media coverage. That is trivially obvious and not actionable. The deployment principle is achieve brand synonymity with a cultural value that already generates media coverage. The distinction is critical. BLM did not seek media coverage of its organization. BLM achieved a position in which media coverage of racial justice was, automatically and without editorial intent, media coverage of BLM. This brand synonymity with a pre-existing cultural conversation is the mechanism that converts externally generated attention into organizational revenue. The deployment process: identify the cultural conversation that is most relevant to your domain: climate change, education inequality, economic anxiety, health disparities. Invest in long-term positioning that makes your brand the default association when that conversation surfaces in media coverage. This is a years-long investment. BLM spent 7 years, 2013 to 2020, building the brand association between Black Lives Matter and response to racial injustice. Before the George Floyd moment catalyzed the fundraising explosion, the acquisition engine is not built in the moment of cultural intensity. It is built in the years preceding that moment through consistent, visible, culturally resonant brand activity that establishes the association in public consciousness. Vector 4, The deliberation collapse infrastructure. BLM's donation pipeline was compressed from weeks to seconds because the emotional intensity of the moment overwhelmed the donor's deliberative process, and the donation infrastructure was frictionless enough to capture the impulse before it dissipated. The deployment principle has two components. Component A, the emotional stimulus must be genuine, immediate, and viscerally engaging. This is not something an organization can manufacture without an external triggering event, but the organization can pre-position itself to be the default beneficiary of triggering events when they occur. The mechanism is preparedness, not creation. Component B, the donation infrastructure must be optimized for impulse conversion. This means one-click donation, stored credit card information through ActBlue, WinRed, or equivalent, mobile-optimized pages that load in under 2 seconds, default donation amounts that are psychologically calibrated to the target audience, and, critically, donation links that are embedded in or immediately adjacent to the emotional content that generates the impulse. The donation link must be 0 clicks away from the emotional stimulus. If the donor must navigate from the content to a separate website, the deliberative process re-engages and the conversion rate drops catastrophically. Vector 5, the social proof cascade trigger. The deployment principle, make giving visible and not giving invisible. This requires 2 design elements. A shareable donation confirmation that allows donors to broadcast their giving to their social network. For example, a branded I donated graphic optimized for Instagram stories, Twitter, and Facebook. And B, a donation page that displays real-time social proof, e.g., 4,327 people donated in the last hour. The visibility asymmetry, giving is visible, not giving is invisible, creates the social proof cascade that drives peer-to-peer conversion without organizational solicitation. Vector 6, the decentralized brand architecture. The deployment principle, create open source identity assets that community members can adopt, adapt, and deploy independently. This means brand visual language, colors, symbols, typography, that is freely available and encouraged for community use, messaging frameworks, key phrases, hashtag formats, that are flexible enough to accommodate diverse interpretations, and a brand proposition that is broad enough to include multiple specific meanings. The organization surrenders control of its brand in exchange for the resilience, scalability, and polymorphism that decentralization provides. Vector 7, the existential urgency pre-position. The deployment principle, map the recurring event categories that generate existential urgency in your domain and pre-position your brand as the default response to those events. For environmental organizations, natural disasters, climate records, species extinction events. For health organizations, pandemics, drug crises, public health emergencies. For education organizations, school funding cuts, literacy statistics, access gaps. The organization cannot control when these events occur, but it can control its readiness to capture the urgency when they do. This readiness includes pre-written email templates that can be deployed within hours of a triggering event, pre-built landing pages optimized for surge traffic, social media response protocols that activate automatically, and relationships with media organizations that ensure the brand is referenced in coverage of the triggering event. Vector 8, the moral cleansing offer. The deployment principle, position the donation not as support our program, but as resolve your complicity. This requires a cultural narrative in which the target audience perceives themselves as implicated in the problem your organization addresses, not through personal wrongdoing, but through systemic participation. The narrative must make the audience feel that their default state, non-action, is morally inadequate, and that the donation is the minimum viable action that restores moral adequacy. This is the mechanism that drives ethical consumption, carbon offset purchases, charitable giving in response to privilege awareness, and a wide range of conscious consumer behaviors. The key insight is that the most powerful marketing message is not, this product is good for you. It is, this product makes you good. Vector 9, the corporate extraction protocol. The deployment principle, create cultural conditions in which corporate non-support is reputationally conspicuous. This requires sufficient cultural salience that media tracks corporate responses or non-responses, employee activism within target corporations that creates internal pressure, a simple binary framework that makes neutrality impossible, you either support X or you do not, and public accountability mechanisms, social media scorecards, media tracking, employee reviews, that make non-support visible. The organization does not need to solicit corporate donations. It needs only to create the conditions in which corporate self-interest demands them. Vector 10, the unfalsifiable product. The deployment principle, sell something that exists in the buyer's self-concept rather than in the external world. This means positioning the product as an identity marker rather than a functional tool. Products can fail, services can disappoint, programs can underperform, but identities are self-validating. They cannot be evaluated against external criteria because they exist internally. The practical implication is that the organization should invest not in promising specific outcomes, which can be audited and found wanting, but in providing identity resources, which are consumed in the act of adoption and cannot be returned. Vector 11, the compound psychological trigger stack. The deployment principle, design experiences that activate multiple giving triggers simultaneously. BLM's power was not any single psychological mechanism. It was the simultaneous activation of 5 mechanisms in a self-reinforcing configuration. The practical implication is that fundraising communications should be designed not to activate a single emotion, sympathy, fear, hope, but to activate a compound emotional state that includes mortality, salience, awareness of threat or suffering, moral dissonance, awareness of one's own inadequacy, social proof, evidence that others are responding, empathic distress, visceral co-experiencing of suffering, and coalitional signaling pressure, awareness that one's response is socially visible. No single trigger deployed in isolation will produce the response that BLM achieved. The compound effect is the mechanism. Vector 12, the depreciation model of moral identity. This is the meta-principle that encompasses all others, and it is the mechanism that generates recurring revenue without organizational solicitation. The principle, create a product, moral identity, that depreciates continuously, requiring continuous repurchase. The depreciation is driven by the ongoing nature of the problem the organization addresses. The problem is never solved, which means the donor's moral identity is never secure, which means the donor must keep investing to maintain their identity position. This is not a subscription model in which the organization sends regular reminders. It is a depreciation model in which the external environment, news coverage, social media, cultural discourse, continuously degrades the donor's existing moral investment and creates new purchase occasions. The organization's role is not to create the depreciation, it is to be the most accessible remedy for it. The final lesson from BLM's fundraising history is this. The most powerful fundraising operation in modern history did not follow any playbook. It did not implement any best practice. It did not hire a finance committee, create a pack kit, plan a tiered event, or send a single direct mail piece. It succeeded because it positioned itself at the intersection of cultural forces so powerful that the traditional fundraising apparatus was not merely unnecessary, it was irrelevant. The money did not flow because BLM asked for it. The money flowed because the culture demanded it, because the convergence of psychological mechanisms, media dynamics, digital infrastructure, and social pressure created an environment in which giving was the path of least resistance, and not giving was the path of maximum psychological, social, and reputational cost. And any brand, product, or movement that can engineer that environment, that can make itself the inevitable destination of a cultural current, will never need to ask for money again. The current will carry the money to them. The only question is whether you are positioned to receive the current when it arrives.